The crowd hushed as footsteps echoed against the marble pathway of Arlington. The air was heavy, as if even the wind refused to trespass this sacred ground. Before them stood the tomb guard, his uniform pressed to perfection, his expression carved in stone. Every measured step was a reminder of those who could no longer walk. Then came Vanessa Caldwell, a figure of confidence, dressed in sharp power and sharper arrogance, striding past security with the kind of entitlement only influence can buy. Cameras turned, reporters whispered, children clutched at their parents. The guard remained still, silent, unmovable pillar in a world addicted to motion. The crowd thought she would show respect. They thought she would bow her head for a fleeting moment of silence. But Vanessa smirked, lifted her chin, and took one step closer than anyone dared. "Move aside," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it sliced through the stillness like a blade. The guard's eyes did not flicker. His rifle rested in disciplined stillness at his shoulder. To him, her words were not orders. They were noise against tradition. A boy in the crowd whispered to his father, "Why isn't he answering?" The father, a veteran with haunted eyes, simply placed a finger to his lips. He understood. The world was about to witness a lesson in silence. Vanessa grew bolder. She laughed. "What is this? A statue? A puppet in uniform?" Reporters, cameras, clicked rapidly. Every insult was recorded, every mocking word immortalized. The tension became unbearable. Some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Others watched with fire in their eyes. It was disrespect at its highest point. Yet the guard's face remained as unreadable as granite. The moment stretched, fragile, dangerous. It felt as if the air itself might shatter. And then Vanessa lifted her hand, hovering just inches from his shoulder. Gasps rippled across the gathering. The crowd knew that line was sacred, invisible yet absolute. The boy whispered again, his voice trembling, "Daddy, what happens if she touches him?" The father answered, almost reverently, "Then the world will see why silence has power." What happened next would shake the internet, flood the news, and ignite a storm of debate. But in that suspended second before action, before consequence, the crowd realized something vital. This was not a guard against a woman. This was honor against disrespect, and the first move was hers. Long before that tense moment with Vanessa Caldwell, the man standing guard had already fought battles most people would never see. His name was not shouted from podiums or carved into monuments. He was simply known as the tomb guard, an anonymous sentinel in an unbroken chain of honor. But behind that still face was a life marked by scars, sacrifice, and silent promises. He had once been a soldier in a distant war. The desert sun had burned his skin, the thunder of artillery had deafened his ears, and the loss of his closest friend had carved a hollow space in his heart. That friend's name was etched into the black wall of memory, a brother in arms who had not come home after the war. While others returned to jobs, families, and forgotten uniforms stuffed into closets, he searched for something he could never quite name. He carried his friend's dog tag in his pocket. Every time he touched it, the weight of unfinished duty pressed harder. That is why he chose this path. Not because it was glamorous, not because it came with medals or recognition, but because it was a vow that as long as he stood, the world would never forget the men and women who no longer could. Arlington was not just a cemetery, it was soil watered by blood, silence louder than gunfire, and stone carved with promises of freedom. Every step on those grounds was a reminder. Tradition is not weakness. Stillness is strength. But the guard's story was only half of the stage that day. The other half belonged to the woman who would try to break him. Vanessa Caldwell was no stranger to the spotlight, a powerful political strategist. She had built her career not on service, but on spectacle. She believed in controlling narratives, controlling people, controlling attention. For her, silence was not power. It was emptiness to be filled with her own voice. She had risen fast in the world of politics. Elegant in her speeches, ruthless in her tactics, Vanessa became a figure both admired and feared. Opponents called her manipulative, supporters called her brilliant, but all agreed on one thing. She loved nothing more than to stand in the center of the storm, commanding it. The tomb of the unknown soldier, to her, was not a place of reverence. It was a stage, a backdrop for her boldness. She saw discipline as weakness, tradition as chains, and silence as submission. That day she had come not to honor but to prove a point. The crowd did not know her full intentions, but whispers swirled even before she arrived. "Isn't that Vanessa Caldwell?" a reporter muttered, adjusting his camera lens. "What's she doing here?" Some veterans stiffened when her name was spoken. They remembered her recent remarks on live television statements, mocking ceremonial traditions as performative gestures of a bygone era. To them, her presence was already an insult, yet the stage was set. One man who believed silence was sacred, one woman who believed silence was weakness, and between them, a place where silence had always carried the greatest weight of all. The guard did not know her name. He did not care. To him, every visitor, whether a president or a schoolchild, was the same. All were expected to honor, to respect, to step lightly on sacred ground. His discipline was not for show. It was for those who could no longer speak, for themselves. But Vanessa knew him, or at least the idea of him. To her, the guard was not a man. He was a symbol, and if she could mock the symbol, if she could bend it, she could prove that tradition itself could be bent. That was her real target, not the soldier, not the uniform, but what the uniform stood for. As she walked toward him, her high heels striking marble like hammers against glass, the crowd began to understand the collision that was coming. Some shifted uneasily, trying to convince themselves it would be nothing, just another politician showing off for the cameras, but others, especially those who had worn the uniform themselves, felt a pit growing in their stomachs. They knew she wouldn't stop at words. The sun dipped slightly behind a cloud. The light softened, but the tension sharpened. Reporters adjusted microphones. Children fidgeted. Veterans stared hard at the guard's face, looking for any flicker, any crack. They found none. He remained stone. She remained fire, and the sacred ground between them prepared to witness a storm. The silence of Arlington was never ordinary. It was a silence that carried echoes of battles, final breaths, and whispered prayers. On that day, it became the stage for a clash unlike any the crowd expected. Vanessa Caldwell advanced slowly, each step deliberate, the heels of her polished shoes striking against the marble with sharp authority. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, like a drumbeat before a charge. Her chin tilted upward, her expression carved into a smirk that dared anyone to stop her. The tomb guard did not move. He did not even blink. His eyes, fixed and focused, remained locked in their eternal watch. His presence was immovable. The first ripple of disrespect came subtle, like a test of waters. Vanessa paused only a few feet from him, folding her arms, and tilted her head mockingly. "This is what they call honor," she said, loud enough for the nearest cameras to pick up. "A man playing statue while the world moves forward." A few gasps stirred from the crowd. Parents held their children tighter. A veteran near the front shifted his weight, his jaw tightening. Yet still the guard did not move. Reporters leaned in, eager for more. Their cameras clicked like insects, buzzing around a wound. They could sense a headline growing, a viral spark waiting for ignition. Vanessa paced in front of him now, circling slowly like a predator toying with prey. "I've seen monuments around the world," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "but at least those are carved from stone. You're just flesh pretending to be granite. A puppet in a costume." Her words hung heavy, offensive, slicing through the reverent air of Arlington. Some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, torn between outrage and morbid curiosity. Others whispered angrily, fists clenched. The guard's rifle rested steady at his shoulder, his white-gloved hands unshaking. His face betrayed no reaction. It was as though the insults had no weight against the centuries of discipline he represented. But Vanessa was not finished. "Tell me," she pressed, leaning closer, her voice dropping but sharp enough for microphones to catch. "When do you break? Do they train you to be silent? Or is silence all you have left after a war that took too much from you?" This time the reaction was different. A woman in the crowd gasped audibly, covering her mouth. A child tugged on his father's sleeve, whispering nervously, "Why is she saying that?" The father, a Marine veteran, did not answer. His eyes were locked on the guard, waiting, knowing the boundaries were being pushed to their limits. The crowd had begun to divide. Some shook their heads, muttering under their breath about respect and decency. Others, drawn in by the spectacle, raised their phones higher, eager to capture the clash. The air buzzed with tension, the sacred silence poisoned by words meant to provoke. Vanessa grew bolder with the attention. She spread her arms, turning slightly to face the crowd. "Look at this," she called out. "Look at the pageantry we still cling to. A man who won't even acknowledge the living, standing here for the dead. Tradition, or just a hollow show." Murmurs grew louder. Veterans in the crowd bristled, their faces flushed with anger. One older man, his jacket pinned with faded service ribbons, muttered, "That uniform's not for show, lady. That's for sacrifice you'll never understand." But Vanessa ignored them. Her target was not the crowd. It was the silent figure before her, the man who refused to give her the satisfaction of reaction. Step by step, her taunts escalated. First words, then gestures. She clapped mockingly, slow and deliberate, each strike of her hands echoing through the marble chamber. "Bravo," she sneered. "The best mime I've ever seen." The tomb guard remained still. His discipline was iron, his silence unyielding. The stillness began to speak louder than her words, and perhaps that is why she pressed further. Silence unnerved her. Silence meant she was not in control. So she stepped closer. Her heels clicked just beyond the invisible line. The crowd knew was sacred. Gasps rippled again. A child whimpered softly. A veteran's hands curled into fists. Reporters leaned forward, their lenses zooming in. Vanessa's smirk widened. "What will you do if I cross this line?" she whispered, though loud enough for all to hear. "Nothing. Because that's what tradition is, nothing. A cage of rules for men too afraid to speak." The moment hung fragile, ready to shatter. Guard's breathing remained steady, his shoulders squared, his eyes unflinching. Every inch of his body screamed restraint, discipline, and loyalty to the creed that silence was not weakness, but strength. But Vanessa mistook silence for surrender. She laughed, tilting her head back. "See, a statue, a relic, and I, future. The world doesn't bow to silence anymore. It bows to those who dare to speak." The crowd erupted in mixed noise, boos from veterans, uneasy whispers from families. The rapid-fire clicks of cameras desperate to capture the moment. The air pulsed with tension so thick it could break, and yet, in the center of it all, the guard stood still, unwavering, a living reminder that not all storms can move mountains. But Vanessa was about to test whether even a mountain could be provoked into motion. She leaned forward, closer than anyone had dared, her hand hovering dangerously near his shoulder. "What now, soldier?" she hissed. "Do you finally prove you're more than stone?" The boy in the crowd, trembling now, whispered to his father. "He won't let her, will he?" The father answered, voice low, certain. "No, he won't move, not unless she forces him." And the world, holding its breath, waited for that force. The world seemed to balance on the edge of a knife. The air at Arlington, normally serene and reverent, had become charged like a thunderstorm was gathering over sacred ground. Cameras whirred, breaths caught, and hearts pounded. The guards' stillness was no longer just discipline, it was defiance. And Vanessa Caldwell, restless under the weight of that defiance, was about to shatter the fragile silence. She leaned closer, her hand now only an inch from his shoulder. The white glove that rested on his rifle strap, immaculate and steady, was the last barrier between provocation and consequence. "You can't ignore me forever," she whispered with a cruel smile. "Even stone cracks." And then she touched him. A collective gasp erupted from the crowd. It was sharp, unified, like a single heartbeat stopping. Some children buried their faces against their parents, while veterans stiffened, rage burning in their eyes. Reporters' shutters clicked frantically, capturing the instant the invisible line was crossed. Vanessa's palm pressed firmly against his shoulder, testing the boundary as though daring him to prove her wrong. The tomb guard did not move, not. At first, for a moment, it seemed as though his discipline would hold even against the ultimate act of disrespect. His jaw remained locked, his eyes fixed, his posture unbroken. He was silence embodied, but then it happened, with mechanical precision, faster than anyone could process. The guard shifted. It was not anger, not chaos. It was pure discipline, executed flawlessly. His left foot stamped once against the marble, the echo booming like a gunshot through the sacred air. His rifle, once resting at his shoulder, dropped to a commanding stance across his chest in one sharp motion. "May A.M." His voice thundered, breaking the silence like a bolt of lightning. "Do not touch the guard." The words exploded with authority, every syllable laced with the weight of centuries of tradition. The sound reverberated off the marble walls, off the hearts of every witness. The silence that followed was even heavier, charged with awe. Vanessa stumbled back a step, her smirk faltering for the first time. She had expected passivity, expected submission. Instead, she had awakened a storm. The boy in the crowd clutched his father's arm, eyes wide. He spoke, he whispered, almost reverently. The father nodded slowly, pride gleaming in his eyes. The crowd was stunned. Some gasped aloud, others applauded instinctively, their hands slapping together in sharp bursts that broke against the silence. Veterans stood straighter, some saluting, others with tears brimming in their eyes. Reporters lowered their cameras, for a second, stunned into stillness themselves. But Vanessa, rattled though she was not ready to surrender the stage. Her cheeks flushed red, part fury, part humiliation. She straightened her jacket, narrowed her eyes, and hissed, "How dare you raise your voice to me? Do you know who I am?" The guard did not answer. His rifle remained across his chest, his body rigid, his face set in stone. His outburst had not been personal, it was duty, protocol, sacred tradition, and now that his warning had been issued, silence reclaimed him. But Vanessa needed control. She stepped forward again, jabbing a finger toward his chest. "I am Vanessa Caldwell. I have the ear of senators. I have the power to ruin men like you." Her voice was sharp, desperate, clawing for dominance. The crowd's reaction turned. Boos rose, low at first, then louder. Veterans shook their heads, disgust evident on their faces. A woman called out, "Show some respect." A man shouted, "This is sacred ground." The tide of public sentiment had shifted. What began as curiosity had become outrage. Still, the guard did not flinch. His silence now loomed larger than her voice. Vanessa's hand twitched, as if tempted to shove him, to prove once and for all that she could break him. But something in the air stopped her, the weight of hundreds of eyes. The unyielding presence of the guard, the sacred silence that seemed to push back against her arrogance. She tried to recover, turning toward the cameras. "Do you see?" she demanded, gesturing to the guard. "This is the problem with clinging to old traditions. Men so trained to obey they forget how to think. Is this strength or is it weakness?" But the words rang hollow now. The crowd wasn't with her. The spectacle she had planned to own had slipped from her hands. What remained was not a show of dominance, but her own exposure, because while she shouted, the guard stood silent. While she flailed, he stood resolute, and while she tried to command the moment had already chosen its victor. A veteran near the front broke into applause. Others followed, the sound growing until it filled the space. Not for Vanessa, for the guard, for the silence that spoke louder than arrogance. Vanessa's smirk faltered again. She had come to humiliate, but she was the one unraveling. And then the final crack. Two security officers approached swiftly from the sidelines. Summoned by the commotion, their expressions were stern, their movements purposeful. The crowd parted as they advanced toward Vanessa. "Ma'am," one officer said firmly, "you need to step back. You've crossed a line." Vanessa's eyes widened. "Me, I'm the victim here. He threatened me." But the crowd laughed bitterly. The irony was too much. The very silence she mocked had turned into the most powerful statement of all. The guard, for his part, had already resumed his post. His rifle snapped back into its ceremonial position at his shoulder. His boots shifted once more, returning to stillness. He had spoken. He had defended the line. And now his silence reclaimed its throne. The boy whispered again to his father, voice trembling with awe. He went back, like nothing happened. The father's reply was simple, because his duty is greater than her noise. The storm had broken, the turning point was clear. Vanessa Caldwell, once so certain of her dominance, now stood exposed not against a man, but against the weight of tradition itself. And tradition had not moved. The air was heavy with judgment. The sacred silence of Arlington, once violated by Vanessa Caldwell's mockery, had been restored not by argument, not by force, but by the guard's thunderous command and immediate return to stillness. His words, so few, had echoed louder than all her speeches. But Vanessa could not accept defeat. Her pride was too sharp, too fragile. The cameras were still rolling, the crowd still watching, and in her mind, there was still time to claw back. Control. She shook off the security officer's warning hands and stepped forward again. Her face flushed, her voice shrill. "You're applauding him," she demanded, turning to the crowd. "A man who can't even answer for himself, a servant, in costume. You call this strength?" Her words fell flat. The crowd was no longer curious, no longer divided. They were united in outrage, in admiration for the guard, in disgust for her. The energy had shifted fully, irrevocably. A woman shouted, "Respect the fallen." Another man bellowed, "You're the disgrace, Caldwell." And then, as if the spirit of the place itself demanded it, a veteran raised his hand in salute toward the guard. Others followed, saluting, standing tall, their silent gesture overwhelming Vanessa's noise. The guard did not react. His eyes stayed forward, his body unflinching. He was not here to bask in applause. He was here for the dead. Vanessa, realizing the tide had turned, grew desperate. She pointed at the guard, her voice trembling with rage. "You don't intimidate me. You think this little performance makes you untouchable. I can ruin you. I can ruin this whole charade." But before she could continue, the two security officers moved decisively, one stepped to her side, the other behind, their presence firm but calm. "Ma'am." The the lead officer said, his voice carrying authority. This is your last warning. You need to leave the grounds immediately. Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. Reporters zoomed in, eager to capture her reaction. Would she submit, or would arrogance push her further? Vanessa scoffed, flipping her hair, trying to recover her composure. I will not be silenced, she snapped. I have every right to be here. The officer's reply was final. Not like this. You've disrespected sacred ground. You are trespassing beyond what's permitted. Step back now or we will escort you. The words hit harder than any insult. Escort her. Vanessa Caldwell, power broker, political strategist, media darling treated like a common trespasser. Her face blanched, then burned crimson. The crowd watched, phones raised, their lenses capturing every twitch of her humiliation. This was no longer her stage. It was her downfall, recorded from every angle. She tried one last attempt, turning toward the cameras, forcing a smirk. This is what America has become, silencing voices, worshipping statues instead of progress. Remember this moment. But the crowd had already decided how they would remember it, not as a victory for her, but as a warning about arrogance. The officers took her by the arms, firm but professional, and began guiding her away from the tomb. Her heels scraped against the marble, no longer sharp, no longer commanding, now desperate. Stumbling, she hissed at them, tried to shake free, but the movement only deepened her humiliation. The guard never flinched. He never turned his head, even as she was dragged away shouting his name. Even as cameras documented her downfall, he remained locked in his post. Silence reclaimed him as though nothing had happened. That silence was the final strike. The crowd erupted not in chaos, but in reverent applause. Some clapped slowly, deliberately, their eyes wet with pride. Others saluted again, holding the gesture longer this time. A young girl whispered, "He's stronger than her," and her mother nodded with tears. But it was the boy from earlier, the one who had asked his father what would happen if she touched the guard who captured the moment's truth. He whispered, almost in awe, "He won, without even moving." The father, eyes shining, answered softly, "That's discipline. That's honor." Reporters filed their stories before even leaving the grounds. Headlines were already forming. Vanessa Caldwell confronts tomb guard and loses one shout. Eternal silence. Guard's discipline goes viral. Tradition versus arrogance. Arlington. Standoff stuns nation. Clips spread instantly across social media. The thunderous command, the sharp step, the rifle snapping into place. It became the soundbite of the week, played over and over again. Vanessa's sneers, her taunts, her humiliation, all recorded in high definition for millions to replay. But the guard never sought cameras. He never sought attention. His victory was not in trending hashtags or viral clips. It was in the fact that order had been preserved, the line had been defended, silence had triumphed. By the time Vanessa was escorted fully off the grounds, crowd had quieted again, respect returned, families bowed their heads, veterans held their salutes, children asked questions their parents answered with reverence, and in the center of it all the guard resumed his eternal watch, as though none of it had happened. His silence was his statement, his stillness was his triumph. Vanessa Caldwell had entered believing she could bend tradition. She left in disgrace, proving only that arrogance bends itself. The guard had not moved for her. The guard had not broken. For her, the guard had not spoken more than he was required. Yet, in that balance of thunder and silence, he had spoken volumes. And the world listened. When Vanessa Caldwell's footsteps faded into the distance, dragged, not chosen, the silence of Arlington returned. It was a silence different from before, heavier, purer, a silence the crowd would never forget. The tomb guard stood unmoved, his rifle back at its ceremonial post, his gaze fixed forward. To a stranger passing by, it might have seemed nothing had happened, but those who had witnessed it knew better. They had seen arrogance collide with tradition, and they had seen which endured. The crowd lingered, unwilling to leave. Parents whispered to children about sacrifice. Veterans stood straighter, their hands trembling as they saluted once more, not to the man himself, but to the ideals he represented. Even reporters, usually quick to pack up once a story was done, hesitated. They seemed humbled, as if unsure whether their cameras had captured the true weight of what they'd witnessed. From the edge of the gathering, a senior officer approached. The colonel's uniform bore medals that told their own story of service, but his face carried something even deeper: pride. He stopped several paces from the guard, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand in a crisp salute. For a brief moment, tradition saluted tradition. The crowd fell into reverent silence again, recognizing the rare exchange. The guard, bound by discipline, did not move, but the meaning was not lost. The colonel lowered his salute with quiet respect, his eyes shining with an unspoken message. Well done, you honored them. Among the crowd, the boy who had asked so many questions tugged gently at his father's sleeve. His voice was small, awed. Daddy, is he a hero? The father crouched to meet his son's eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't exaggerate. His answer was simple. He's more than that. He's a promise. The boy frowned, confused, but the words lingered. They would grow with him. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the marble. Visitors began to leave, slowly, reverently, but the memory of what they had seen clung to them. They carried it home in whispers, in text messages, in the recordings already spreading online. The guard himself remained still, as though carved from the very stone he watched over. Inside. However, he felt the weight of the moment settled deep in his chest. Not pride, not triumph, something quieter. When the shift ended, long after the crowd had gone and silence once again belonged solely to the resting, the guard returned to the barracks. He unfastened his rifle, polished every inch of it with care, and folded his gloves, with the same precision as every day before. His movements were ritual, a meditation. But tonight, he paused. From his pocket, he drew a worn piece of metal, a dog tag. His fingers curled around it, thumb tracing the faded letters of his fallen friend's name. He held it for a long time, head bowed, the memory of laughter and brotherhood alive for a moment in his silence. They saw you today, he whispered under his breath, a rare breach of his own quiet. They remembered. On the small desk, beside his bed rested a note he had carried since his war days. It was creased, yellowed with time, but the words still burned. Never forget, never falter, stand for those who cannot. He placed the dog tag beside it, letting the two sit together in the stillness. The world outside might remember the day for its spectacle, for the humiliation of a powerful woman, for the viral clips. But for him, it was simpler. It was about holding the line, about proving that tradition still meant something, even in a world eager to mock it. As he lay back on the narrow bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, the weight of duty pressed against him, but so too did a quiet peace. He had not moved for arrogance. He had not faltered for provocation. He had stood, as countless before him had stood, and as countless after him would stand. And tomorrow, when the sun rose again, he would put on the uniform, take up his post, and resume the silence that spoke louder than any words. The day Vanessa Caldwell stepped onto sacred ground, believing she could bend it to her will, the world learned a lesson it will not soon forget. She came with arrogance, with noise, with the belief that tradition was nothing but an empty shell. And yet, in the end, she was the one broken not by force, not by argument, but by something far greater, by silence. The tomb guard did not move. For her, he did not debate her. He did not fall into her trap of noise. He simply stood, unflinching, embodying the vow he had made, to honor those who could no longer speak. And when the line was crossed, he defended it not with anger, but with precision, with discipline, with the thunder of duty. That is why the moment struck so deeply, because it reminded us of something we often forget in a world of shouting voices, endless arguments, and constant noise. True strength is not always in the loudest words, but in the quietest resolve. Vanessa Caldwell walked away humiliated, her name trending for all the wrong reasons. But the guard returned to stillness. He had no interest in victory, no craving for applause. His duty was never about himself. It was, and always will be, about the fallen, those whose silence is eternal, and who deserve to be honored by silence just as eternal. And so the clip spread, shared millions of times, debated on television, replayed in classrooms and living rooms. Some argued about politics, some about respect, but most agreed on one thing. In that confrontation, tradition had not been weakness, it had been strength. Because tradition is a promise, stillness is a shield. Silence, when chosen, is power. That is the legacy of the tomb guard. Not a statue, not a puppet, not a relic of the past, but a living testament to honor, a reminder that in a world rushing forward, there are places where we must stop, bow our heads, and remember. And perhaps the most powerful part of all, the guard never wanted to be a hero. He never sought recognition, yet in his refusal to bend, in his refusal to break, he became a symbol, not of himself but of every life cut short, every sacrifice made, every voice silenced in service to something greater. So let this story remind you, and remind us all, that tradition is not weakness, that stillness is strength, that silence can roar louder than arrogance ever could. If this moment moved you, share it. not for the spectacle, not for the downfall of one arrogant voice, but for the legacy of those who can no longer speak, because every view, every share, every whisper of respect keeps their memory alive. And in the end, that is what honor truly means.